Welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. My name is Carl Stychin, and I'm the Director of ILS. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this conversation with legal theorist and novelist, Professor Aleardo Zanghellini, on the topic Reimagining Same-Sex Histories. This event is part of the National Being Human Festival of the Humanities, which is taking place across the UK between the 12th and the 22nd of November. Being Human is the only national festival of the humanities run by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Professor Zanghellini is currently Professor of Law and Social Theory at the University of Reading School of Law. His work is interdisciplinary in nature and regularly appears in leading international journals. Much of it is in the field of law and sexuality, but he also interrogates general concepts and principles of political morality that are of interest to political philosophers and public lawyers. His 2015 book, The Sexual Constitution of Political Authority, is an analysis of the erotic dimensions of state power. It argues that the disavowal of same-sex desire has been and partly remains central to the mainstream understandings of political authority. In 2018, Aleardo published his first novel, The Spellbinders. This historical epic chronicles the life and loves of Edward II, reimagining the relationship of Edward II, Piers, Gaveston, and Queen Isabella, amongst others. In so doing, the novel skillfully illuminates the ideas and concepts discussed in Aleardo's academic research. It's also a hugely readable and enjoyable book, gripping and, I should add, also erotically charged. The format for today's event is as follows. Aleardo and I will discuss his work in interview format, and audience members are welcome and encouraged to contribute questions and comments throughout the discussion in our Q&A function. I will attempt to moderate those interventions throughout the interview. Aleardo has also agreed to read a passage from the novel for us. Aleardo Zanghellini, welcome to the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies and the Being Human Festival.
Thank you very much, Carl. Thank you for having me.
I want to begin by talking a little bit about the writing of historical fiction. Now, in preparing for our discussion, I did a bit of research on advice for the writing of historical fiction, not because I was tempted myself, but I wanted to learn a bit about the challenges. And I must say that what comes up are a series of challenges which strike me as incredibly daunting. What drew you to this genre? And can you tell us a bit about your process? I'm particularly interested in how you do research, your use of language, and the relationship between historical accuracy and fiction.
Yeah, sure. So I guess what drew me to this genre, for many years, I almost only read classics, largely, though not exclusively, of English literature. And even now, a lot of my, the fiction that I read is out of print novels from the early and mid 20th century. So in a way, I've always associated, literature with history and with the past. So even if these books were not meant as pieces of historical fiction when they were written, because they were describing contemporary realities, to a 21st century reader, they read like period pieces. So in that way, a lot of the ways in which I relate to literature is in relation to the past. And I didn't really set out to write in the genre of historical fiction. I never thought that now I'm going to reinvent myself as a writer of historical fiction. I wanted to write a story about Edward II because his life was so dramatic and his story is so romantic, and it just looked to me like it was just, the perfect stuff for fiction. And that's why I ended up writing in that genre. It was almost like an accident as a result of just wanting to write about Edward. you asked me about the process as well. For my 2015 book, the academic book, I read all the chronicles that were contemporary or almost contemporary to Edward II's life. So the 14th century chronicles, which had been published in the 19th century. And so, you don't actually need to go and read a medieval manuscript. You can actually access those sources in libraries, and the University of Reading, my institution, had those sources. I also relied obviously on secondary literature. And that's actually where I discovered the story of Edward. The sources themselves are so interesting, and, they will tell stuff such as, the moment Edward II set eyes on Piers Gaveston, he fell in love with him. I mean, they will literally say something almost as explicit as that. So, for somebody who's same-sex attracted, that, having been written in the 14th century, that is kind of tickles your imagination, right? I have consulted a number of secondary sources, and I have to say I did extra research for the book because I didn't need to delve into all the aspects of Edward's life for the purposes of writing my academic book. But I did when I wanted to write a fictionalized biography, if you like, of Edward II, which is what I tried to do in my novel. And so I read extra sources there. I have to say that the one author whose work has been most useful to me and who saved me tons of time and didn't just save me tons of time, realistically, she made possible what wouldn't otherwise have been possible, is Catherine Warner. So Catherine Warner is an independent scholar who is, I'm sure, can be easily defined as the contemporary foremost authority on Edward II, certainly on Edward II's personal, private life. So, there are a lot of historians who write about the political or public aspects of his rule, but Catherine Warner, is the person who actually goes and reads all these manuscripts in Anglo-French and is able to decipher that that particular calligraphy, and who will discover all the juicy details, which then I used for the purposes of my novel. You asked me about the use of language as well. Again, I never set out to try to make this sound even remotely 14th century. I thought that would have actually detracted from, the immediacy and the attempt at actually making the story come to life to contemporary readers. So in a way, I almost treated 14th century, and God knows, I mean, at the court they were probably speaking French, but or probably a mixture of French and English at the time. But I certainly wasn't going to try making it sound like Chaucer or anything like that, right? So once I felt free to just, tell the story to contemporary audiences, for me it was a matter of not being completely anachronistic by, for example, using the term homosexuality, which, as you know, didn't really come into usage until the 19th century and didn't really have a proper referent until then, in the sense that homosexuality points to that kind of particular identity and psychology, which, a number of ideas that were alien up to that point in history. So I try to avoid anachronisms in that sense. But as long as my sense or my understanding was that people in the 14th century could have a sense or a particular concept, then I used contemporary words to refer to that concept. So I'll give you an example of something that a reader pointed out to me. At one point, Edward says that of Lancaster or some of his other, of the barons that were making his life difficult. In the book, I make him say that they were wankers. And, and somebody told me, oh, that sounds so, out of place. And I thought, well, but it's entirely possible that the word wanker hadn't been coined at that point, but certainly people had a concept of what a wanker was. And the fact that, theology and the Bible loomed large at the time, and the device of Onan and so on was something that would have been thought of as something disreputable, it actually makes perfect sense for Edward to express himself by using that word. So in a way, I thought I would be translating the language for contemporary readers. So I didn't feel particular hang-ups about the use of language. One of the reviews said, that I use a deliberative style, which, is something a little bit strange for a deliberative prose, which is a bit strange, I suppose, for a novel. And I guess it's perhaps because I'm an academic and so I'm used to write in that style. Thankfully, the review also said that the style worked because it illuminated the historical record, but also gave the characters urgency and agency. So I thought, well, that's fine then. But yes, I have a slightly kind of formal way of writing, which I thought actually happened to suit the context, because, we're dealing mostly with aristocrats. And so the fact that it comes across as a bit formal or a bit stilted at times, I thought it actually kind of suits the general idea of court life. It helped to create that kind of atmosphere.
I think that's right. If I could just say, I would have described it as it's a kind of stylized style, and I think it works really well. And I'm surprised it wasn't. I think you're very modest in describing it, but for me as a reader, it's quite remarkable as to how it's a kind of hybrid between modern and something else. So I think you're probably too modest.
I think that was accidental, It is that kind of hybrid. I'm glad you thought it works. But I wrote the way I know how to write, not without overthinking it, I suppose.
Right. And historical obviously historical fiction is fiction, but it is also, you're dealing with historical figures. And how did you kind of strike that balance between accuracy and storytelling?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think I was quite strict with myself to the extent that I was not going to mess up, as writers of historical fiction often do. I wasn't going to mess up the timeline. I wasn't going to write anything that was not compatible with the historical record as far as I know what it is. I'm sure, somebody who is a real expert and made, Kathleen Warner could perhaps look at the novel and identify bits where perhaps it doesn't quite match, that minor episode in Edward's life that she would be the only person in the world who's aware of. But whatever I was able to establish was the historical record. I made sure that the fiction would be consistent with it. And then, of course, that still leaves you quite a lot of space for maneuver. And that's where, I let my fantasy, my imagination go free. And I actually find it a really, a way of writing that really suited me, as opposed to writing. So, and I think that's because I'm an academic, right? So my writing is always constrained by the current literature, right? Because you have to respond to the literature, you have to take the literature into account, you have to engage in a conversation with what other academics are saying. And in a way, I was doing the same thing. I felt like, right, there are these parameters or these constraints, which is what the historical record is, and I'm just going to work with them. And I was happy to do that. And then I really found it satisfying to be able to play with the facts as they were in order to then make them fit together in ways that the historical record is silent, but you make them fit together. You kind of make them work together in a way that creates, further sort of interesting aspects in the story. So that was really interesting. So basically, whatever you read in the book, or much of it happened at the time and in the places where the book says it happened. And I actually wrote an afterword in the book where I try to broadly say what is made up and what is not.
Okay. Well, I want to try now to draw out the connections between your novel and your academic research, and in particular your monograph, The Sexual Constitution of Political Authority. First, I should say that the monograph is itself a tremendous achievement as an academic work. It examines the shifting ways in which political authority has been culturally constructed in relation to same-sex desire throughout history. So it is really, it romps through a lot of history. And specifically, you argue that same-sex desire has been perceived as affecting the good exercise of public powers. I wonder what were the challenges you found in making this argument. It's a very intriguing argument. It's compelling when you read it, but particularly as someone drawn to Foucault's understanding of history and sexuality as culturally and historically contingent, how do you square the argument with a claim? How do you square your argument, which is a claim that same-sex desire marks one's subjectivity throughout history, with that notion of cultural and historical contingency?
Yeah, so it's as you of course know, because I learned these things from your own work in the first instance many years ago. Foucault's argument is that homosexuality as a sexual identity, as a human type, was an invention of the late 19th century, right? So up to that point, people were seen as being engaging in same-sex sexual activity that might be or might not be frowned upon. It might, lead you to being punished by the criminal law system. But you were not seen as a special type of human being by virtue of engaging in acts with people, sexual acts with people of the same sex as you. And then from the 19th century onwards, this idea came of homosexuality as an identity, not just as acts, as the kind of describing a psychic essence, right? But since Foucault, obviously, scholars have contributed to this analysis, and apart from the fact that people disagree about when exactly same-sex desire turned into an identity from acts into an identity, but also there have been scholars that have looked historically both at the West and beyond the West and have identified what they call sexual subjectivities. So Halperin, for example, says that it's true that people who engage in same-sex conduct might not have in the past been seen in terms of modern homosexual identity, but that doesn't mean that they were not associated with particular sexual subjectivities, right? So he gives the example of the Kinaidos in Greco-Roman antiquity. Samar Habib, one of my dear friends who has written about female homosexuality in the Middle East in medieval Islam, has identified the ways in which very distinct sexual identities can be deduced from the sources, from the ways in which the sources talk about same-sex desire between women. So much so that she calls it, female homosexuality in the Middle East. And she thinks there's nothing anachronistic about calling it that way, because she can actually see that some of the features that mark contemporary same-sex sexual subjectivities can actually be traced into the past, many centuries before when it is claimed that they actually emerged. So basically, the jury is out there in terms of studies. I mean, the dominant idea is that identities didn't really, that sexual identities are a relatively modern phenomenon, but there is disagreement about that. But in any case, my argument is about really, as far as I see it, my argument in the academic book is about the subject position of ruler and how the idea of a paradigmatic or ideal ruler tended to rule out, pardon the pun, a sexual orientation towards the same sex. But importantly, it ruled out a sexual orientation towards the same sex in different ways throughout the centuries. Also, my argument is confined to the British context, except for the first chapter where I talk about Greco-Roman antiquity, because it was a point of reference that in the Middle Ages people were already discussing. But all the arguments that I make in the academic book, in the Sexual Constitution of Political Authority, are really confined to Britain. So in a way, I'm not trying necessarily to make a claim about the necessity of the idea of statesmanship being marked by same-sex desire. I'm just saying, as a matter of historical fact, if we look at certain salient figures that were known to be same-sex attracted, in all of their cases, and of course I only deal with a few case studies in the book, there would be more. In all of those cases, it was never the case that same-sex desire was treated as purely a matter of indifference to their rule. In one way or another, this is what the sources reveal, it was always used and deployed against them to try to discredit their rule. So it's, in a way, it's a more modest claim perhaps than might at first sight appear. I don't have an answer about whether it's a matter of historical or psychological necessity that I do suggest that it might be, but I'm not taking a definitive stance on it.
Great. Just to tease this out a bit, one of the key points in the monograph, I think, is your claim that the special danger that same-sex desire poses for good government is not that it is indicative of a broader sense of moral corruption, nor of a deviant subjectivity, nor even that it attracts God's displeasure and his curse. Rather, you argue, for most of the sources examined, same-sex desire creates the conditions that facilitate the cultivation of bad habits in a leader. Can you elaborate on what you mean by this?
Yeah, so this is a point that actually is specific to my analysis of Edward II, rather than the ways in which same-sex desire has been seen as a problem for the good exercise of public powers throughout the centuries. So this is a specific point I make in relation to Edward II to explain how his same-sex desire was taken by others to unfit him for kingship. Now, there are some 14th century sources that actually do hint at the idea that his same-sex desire was bad for kingship because it was a sign of moral corruption, or because it tended to suggest a divine subjectivity, or because it would attract divine punishment. So those ideas are actually present even as far back as the time of Edward II, although they become more dominant in subsequent ages. Robert of Reading, for example, so one of the dubious distinctions that Reading, where the town where I work, has, is to be the affiliation of Robert of Reading, who was a monk who spewed venom on Edward II. And Robert of Reading, for example, portrays Edward's same-sex desire as the expression of a fundamentally corrupt nature. So, for Robert of Reading, Edward was cruel, false, greedy, stupid, and so he could not fail to also be same-sex attracted, being the sinner and generally morally corrupt person that he was. Now, other sources are a bit more subtle. So some passages in another contemporary source, the Gesta, for example, they say that Edward was, and I'm quoting here, handsome in body, of surpassing physical strength, but, as is commonly said, very different in his habits. Now, the Gesta goes on to give a clue about what these different habits might be. So Edward had a ready tongue, a taste for lavish entertainment, and he ignored the company of noble men and preferred to consort with actors, singers, grooms, and sailors. Now, that all sounds rather stereotypically gay to me, in the modern sense of the word, where gayness points to a deviant subjectivity, keeping disreputable company, saying inappropriate and outrageous things, delighting in the pleasure of the senses. So in these sources, Edward is portrayed as a bad ruler because being same-sex attracted meant being deviant, or in Robert of Reading's version, being morally corrupt. But these are actually very unusual ways of problematizing the relationship between political authority and the same-sex desire in the case of Edward. It's only a small minority of sources that does so. The majority of the medieval sources took issue with Edward's same-sex desire for an altogether different reason. Basically, that his desire made him vulnerable to the bad advice of his favorites. And the fact that he let these favorites, therefore, rule alongside him, rule the country alongside him. And they lacked the lineage to be kings. And therefore, they also, according to medieval epistemologies, medieval ways of knowing the world, they lacked the capacity to actually properly act as rulers, because, having the correct lineage meant having God's endorsement to be the ruler. So to the extent that Edward allowed people who were not meant to be legitimized by divine power to shape public policy, he was kind of doing something really serious. So these people lacked the God-given capacity to rule, and yet Edward let them rule alongside him. Basically, the dominant narrative that you can see from the 14th century sources is that same-sex desire predisposes you as a ruler, or exposes you to the risk of ruling poorly, because it will cloud your judgment, and you're basically going to have your favorites who are going to rule not only you but the country itself. And that is the dominant story about Edward II. It's not really the fact that he was doing something horrible by engaging in sodomy. It's not really the fact that he had a divine subjectivity. It's not really the fact that he was morally corrupt in some way, but just that he kind of slipped into those bad habits of letting other men who didn't have the divine endorsement to rule alongside him.
Right. I take your point that that's quite specific to Edward II, but the idea of bad habits does resonate throughout the monograph, including, and I suppose they're somewhat different bad habits, but including in the 20th century, with your discussion of same-sex desire as security risk, not only with the threat of blackmail, but of a broader unsuitability for high office. Could you explain this?
Yes. So the book argues that when a statesman, same-sex desire was used, as it invariably was used against him for political ends, it was in different ways. So the grounds or reason why same-sex desire was alleged to make you a bad ruler or a bad statesman changed from one era to the next. They were responsive to the contingencies of each historical moment, but there was also considerable historical continuity. And actually, what is particularly interesting about the case of Edward II is that in a way he became the bad ruler par excellence, the bad same-sex attracted ruler par excellence, right? The paradigmatic example of what same-sex desire does to rulers. And so, when you look at, for example, the ways in which historians talked about the rules of the rule of James I, somebody like Thomas Birch, who curated an edition of writings about James I, described the rule of James I as the age of the Gavestons and dispensers revived, without the energy in public opinion that pursued these minions with so signal a punishment. Now, this is a reference to the ways in which Gaveston was treacherously killed, and the ways in which Hugh Dispenser was hung, drawn, quartered, castrated, you name it. And basically an expression of regret at the fact that the favorites of James I didn't quite meet the same fate. So in the mid-20th century, as you mentioned, the main way in which public official same-sex desire was seen as threatening public service was by being apprehended as a security risk. So basically, the fact that same-sex desire was criminalized had always meant that well-to-do same-sex attracted men were at the mercy, if you like, of their less well-to-do lovers who could always blackmail them by threatening to expose them. And this is this association between blackmail and homosexuality is really old. It goes back to the 18th century in England. But it is also surprisingly prominent in the mid-20th century, where British discourses around homosexuality appear. You often see this idea of blackmail popping up. Now, part of the reason why it seemed this idea of blackmail seemed to have experienced a revival interest in the mid-20th century were the kind of heightened security concerns because of the Cold War in the post-war Britain. So in the middle of the 20th century, for a public official to be gay, and now we can start using that word because, of course, by that time it was coming into general use, it meant being seen as liable to being blackmailed into revealing confidential information, state secrets. But that was not the only reason why in the 20th century, being a same-sex attracted statesman was seen as a security risk. In the United States, the so-called lavender scare was in full swing at that time, which meant that hundreds of gay and lesbian employees were dismissed from the Department of State and other branches of the public service because they were seen as disloyal to the United States. And Senator McCarthy went so far as claiming that lesbians and gay men suffered from a mental disorder, which would in turn make them politically disloyal and predispose them to communism. Others viewed lesbians and gay men as unsuited for public office because they had a purported emotional instability and mental instability, which meant that quite apart from any security risk that they might pose, they were just unsuited to be given the task of civil service related ones. Now, it's not necessarily a matter of general knowledge, as far as I can see, that these representations, which were current in the United States, were, for a relatively brief period, quite, taken seriously on this side of the Atlantic as well. And the parliamentary debates are very clear on this. If you just look up the Unsaid and you just whenever there is a debate about homosexuality, not only does the notion of blackmail come up, but also you can often see this idea of disloyalty being discussed, in some cases because people were trying to argue against it. But obviously a number of parliamentarians were taking it quite seriously. You can also see it in the trial against Lord Montagu, Peter Wildblood, and Michael Pitt Rivers. The trial for gross indecency, the second trials, because Lord Montagu had already undergone a first trial. The prosecution, before the jury issued the verdict, declared that the high character of the defendants should not be seen as a bar to a guilty verdict. And now I'm quoting, and the prosecution said, and this is such, this is why doing historical research is so good, because you just find this really interesting stuff. So we are dealing with the dark and mysterious realms of sex. How little do we know, any of us, about the sex lives of our neighbors? Now, the idea of a dark and mysterious sexuality references psychoanalytic tropes, obviously, but the ominous reference to what is going on unbeknownst to us in our neighbors' bedrooms implicitly trades on an imagery of Soviet sympathizer plotting behind the closed doors in the midst of 1950s picket-fest middle-class suburbia. So, if you read between the lines, you can see the currency of this obsession with disloyalty and the ways in which same-sex desire was discursively or rhetorically associated with that idea of disloyalty in the United Kingdom, not just in the United States.
I mean, I'm reminded, and it's interesting how these kind of stereotypic tropes can resonate even up to the present day, but get flipped around as well. Some years ago, I was doing some research in South Africa, and I was told, and who knows? The other thing is, who knows what's true or what becomes myth that gets reworked? That in the anti-apartheid struggle, the ANC would often use gay men as spies because they were really good as spies, as being able to lead a double life. So it kind of gets turned into this quality that's actually very positive from the point of view of a resistance struggle. So, maybe we should, to kind of seize these stereotypes as having also positive reappropriate them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And actually, if your scholarship and the scholarship of queer theorists that teaches one anything is the way in which you can engage in that process of transvaluation, right?
Thank you. Now, so I think getting back to Edward II, you argue, and I found it very persuasive that same-sex desire gets historically aligned to a kind of immature decision making, and I think that also resonates right up into the Cold War context. And I think you rightly demonstrate this in your discussion of Christopher Marlowe's Edward II, which is, I think, a play with which many of us will be very familiar. Now, is your aim in the Spellbinders to challenge that construction of same-sex desire leading to immature decision-making, or does it kind of illustrate it or reinforce it as well, or maybe both? Because, to me as a reader of the novel, it does seem that Edward's judgment as king goes a bit awry, goes a bit wonky whenever he starts falling in love, particularly his later loves. You could argue private passions have overtaken public duty, which is always a big no-no for the crown. So, how does the novel sit with this notion of same-sex desire and poor decision making?
Yeah, so I guess in a way the novel is not trying to make a political point, and so really no fan of Edward II, and I count myself as one of his fans, could ever claim that he was a successful ruler. I doubt, however, that his poor leadership had much or anything to do with his same-sex desire per se. In the sense that Edward seemed fundamentally uninterested in ruling. He liked digging ditches, he liked rowing, thatching, fishing, all activities that were seen as highly disreputable for a king. It seems clear that quite simply he couldn't care less about ruling the country. And I find that quite charming myself, barring the catastrophic consequences it led to. Let us also acknowledge that, he had some intractable problems on his hands. His father had supposedly subdued Scotland, except he never did, because there was never a moment's peace in the relationships between England and Scotland at that time. So, Edward had that to deal with. He had external threats to deal with. Another ruler might or might not have won Bannockburn, but the fact that Edward happened to lose somehow cemented his reputation as a loser overall. Yet, if you look at the magnates of the time who were trying to control Edward throughout his reign on the ground that he could not rule, they do not paint a very pretty picture either. The Earl of Pembroke, Aymer de Valence, seems the exception. And the book tries to draw that out. I'm quite sympathetic to Pembroke. But most of the others seems to have been as flawed as Edward, if not more flawed than he himself was. The liberators themselves, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, who took over the helm of the realm after defeating Edward and imprisoning him, proved to be every bit as callous and greedy as Edward and Hugh Despenser had been. Edward was a lousy ruler, and immaturity describes the ways in which he exercises political power, as well as any other description. But his immaturity is responsible for how he let his same-sex desire cloud his political judgment. It is not the fact that he was same-sex desire that led to his immaturity as a ruler. So the way I see it, if he had been attracted to women, and being the kind of person that he was, fundamentally uninterested in government and wanted to just go out and have sex and thatch and ditch, he would have been just as bad a ruler. So in that sense, I suppose the book, if read carefully, does not reinforce, for readers who are in good faith, the idea that same-sex desire is a cause of poor political leadership. It does reinforce the point that Edward was, whether same-sex attracted or not, a poor ruler.
Right. Well, Therefore, the big problem, it seems to me, as you rightly ascribe in your analysis of political authority, is not so much the sexual act, but it's the falling in love that gets you in trouble. Falling in love and how that impacts upon judgment, this conflation of the public and the private. I did wonder, though, if you almost prove too much with that argument. And when I think about the lesson of monarchy throughout the 20th century, even throughout the 20th century, has been that the crown gets itself into big trouble, not through sex itself, and indeed people may be encouraged to sow their wild oats. And here I'm thinking of heterosexual acts, but in falling in love with inappropriate opposite-sex people, or maybe just falling in love is a bad idea. It's that which seems to create mayhem. And in the 20th century, you can't help but think of Edward VIII, who provides the perfect illustration of this. And it's interesting, the way in which he was constructed, rightly or wrongly, was as being immature, self-centered, I suppose also a Nazi, but yet also presumably heterosexually inclined. But then I started to wonder, well, or is he somehow being discursively homosexualized in that process of being constructed as immature, self-centered, as unfit to rule?
Yeah, I guess, I would have to study the sources on Edward VIII to be able to answer your question. The last point you made about whether he was discursively homosexualized. It would be interesting to actually read, newspapers, archives and see how he was discussed in newspapers and whether there is an element of that. It's interesting that for much of its history, homosexuality or same-sex desires seem to be associated with this idea of an excess of sort of sexual drive, right? So, homosexuals in a way were seen as sexually, or same-sex attracted people were seen as sexually excessive. And so they would let themselves be ruled by their senses and basically be non-discriminating in the kind of relationships they had. It is an intriguing possibility what you say about the possible discursive homosexualization of Edward VIII. For the book, the point that I was trying to make is not necessarily that same-sex desire is the only ground on which one's suitability for public office has historically been questioned, obviously. I also don't claim that the representation of rulers or statesmen as immature and self-centered is only triggered in the case of same-sex attracted rulers. And I also don't claim that same-sex desire is invariably constructed as a problem for public office in that particular way. So by enabling that is a representation of gay public officials as self-centered or immature. My point is that there is this constant pattern of an association between same-sex desire and bad political rule, so unsuitability for public office. But the grounds on which that association is made vary, although there is, as I said, some continuity. And I guess what's most interesting is the plasticity of that notion that basically same-sex desire makes you, at least presumptively, unfit for public office. That notion seems to have persisted through the centuries, but it took many different forms. And the immaturity is one element of continuity, but as I said, it's not necessarily the only way in which it manifested itself, that association. And also it's not necessarily only specific to same-sex desire. It just is picked on in some cases when same-sex desire is at issue, the same-sex desire of a public official.
Great. Well, as promised, you're going to, you've agreed to give us a short taster from the Spellbinders, which I think will be show our audience kind of that style of writing we talked about earlier. We'll come back when you're finished. I'll ask some more questions and also questions from our audience. So this is Aleardo Zanghellini and the Spellbinders.
Okay, so this is a passage that happens after the death of Pierre Gaveston and before Edward falls in love with Hugh Dispenser. So in the meantime, he became attached to three men, and here is a dialogue between two of them. One of them is I pictured him as a straight man, quite kind of lovable and naive, and the other one is a same-sex attracted man who is the opposite. So Audley had been looking at him in silence. Very well, Lord Amory. He removed his foot from the slab and, straightening his body, proffered his hand. Damory shook it. An unnecessary rift had been averted. Still, Audley said, the nature of your ascendance to the king's favor remains a mystery. The nature of mine, on the other hand, must be obvious to anyone. I'm decidedly too handsome to leave observers in any doubt about it. Do you still sleep with the king, then? Asked Lord Damory, thinking he had managed to strike the right note this time. A little bold by his standards, but it showed he was not a prig after all. Still? Was I supposed to stop at any point? I mean, since your marriage, of course. Pray, in what universe is that supposed to make a difference, Lord Damory? I don't know, I thought. Audley laughed amiably. Lord Damory, if you keep this act up, you might convince me that you actually are as pure as you claim to be. Here's some news for you. I'm far too attached to the material rewards that accompany the king's interest in me to give up sleeping with him unless he tires of me. As you can see, no one can accuse me of being anything other than perfectly honest. Besides, the king is very handsome and is really quite extraordinarily good at, but I don't suppose the details would mean much to you. Audley sat down on the grass. His tone had been a mixture of the mischievous and benevolently patronizing. For a brief moment, Damory wondered if, in failing to respond to the king's kiss almost 2 years before, he had ended up missing out. A sigh came out of him, unbidden. Then Audley said, if you're unwilling to reveal the secret of your own social ascendance, Lord Damory, perhaps you happen to understand the source of Lord Montague's. Damory looked around. No sign of Montague's arrival yet. He wondered if the Pact of Alliance could go ahead in the absence of one of the parties intended to share in it. Looking down to where Audley was sitting, cross-legged, he said, isn't Lord Montague the king's friend? Hasn't he been in his household for years? But so have I, Lord Damory. Being the king's friend, whatever that means, and belonging to his household constitute no special qualification for having influence upon him. Don't they? Certainly not. Lord Audley paused to reflect. I suspect it's his wit. Lord Montague's is awfully clever and very amusing. More amusing than me, alas. The king must be sorely missing Lord Gaveston's wit. Clearly he looked for a substitute in Lord Montague. You would too if you had been Lord Gaveston's lover. His company could be quite addictive. Damory sat down next to Audley. I could never satisfy King Edward's need for witty conversation. No, I think we are agreed on the fact that that is not your strongest point. But you have other virtues. You bear yourself well, and you're not terribly bad to look at. Though you don't do yourself any favors donning that ancient robe, you know. In any case, I suspect that your appeal for the king has to do with virtues of which you are possessed, that are of a more spiritual variety, so to speak, which makes me think. Audley paused, and Damory raised his eyebrows quizzically. Do you think, Lord Damory, that we make up one Gaveston? I mean the three of us, Montague, you and I. Do you think we add up to one Lord Gaveston? What do you mean, Lord Audley? The sum of our qualities. Montague has something of Gaveston's wit. You have Gaveston's devotion to the king, his purity of heart. Damory felt his face blush. You're also a very good soldier, I'm told. Now that leaves me. I'm a decent soldier too. Additionally, let me see. He stood up. Impeccable refinement, unmatched dapperness, winsome smile, good looks, exquisite arse. Lord Audley threw a glance over his shoulder at his own backside. In fact, it seems to me I contribute rather more than my fair share to this collaborative effort of ours to recreate Sir Piers Gaveston for the king's benefit. Wouldn't you agree, Lord Damory? Damory had stopped listening at exquisite arse. Sitting as he still did on the ground, he happened to have as unobstructed a perspective on Audley's backside as he recalled ever enjoying. Realizing belatedly that Lord Audley had asked his opinion, he began to say, Audley winked. Rhetorical question, you know? Anyway, this theory of mine, isn't it as good an explanation as any for why the three of us are meeting here today to agree on a pact of mutual support, you, Montacute, and I? I confess that the rationale behind it seemed a little obscure to me, but now all is explained. We came into the king's favor at about the same time to satisfy a single need, and we'll all fall out of it simultaneously too. So we must take care that we don't. And that requires a coordinated effort. Forgive me, but I find it hard to follow you. Audley extended his arm to help him to his feet. Of course you do, but let me explain. If one of us falls out of favor, the spell will be broken and the others too will necessarily follow suit. The king will lose interest in the illusion once the illusion is revealed for what it is, the illusion of Sir Gaveston that we collectively conjure up for him. Hence the need for us to work together.
Thank you. I think it's a great passage. It's a hilarious passage, and it reminded me just how much I like Damery in the novel, which may say something that Stu, he's so sweet, and I was always cheering for him. So thanks very much for sharing that. I want to turn now to the depiction of women in the Spellbinders. Queen Isabella, I think, is drawn very sympathetically by you. She's comes across as very shrewd, and she recognizes, and yet she's very fond of Piers Gaveston. But she does recognize that Hugh Despenser the Younger is bad news, which is probably very shrewd. Bad news not only for herself, but for the crown and the kingdom. To quote from you as academic, Hugh illustrates perfectly that same-sex desire is dangerous to well-ordered rule because a king in love with another man may treat him or allow him to act as a co-ruler even if the latter lacks the prerogative and hence the natural capacity to rule in the best possible way. We've talked about that earlier in our conversation. Now, she does, it seems to me, have that natural capacity, and she fully recognizes this difference. Is that a fair assessment of?
Yes. Yes, I mean, everyone assumes Isabella must have hated both Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, but there's no evidence that she had any problem with Piers at all. There are stories made up that, much later that seem to create this antagonism between them. But Catherine Warner has made, has shown a lot of these as being fabrications, such as the idea that, Edward gave the jewels that were given to him by Isabella's father on their wedding, they gave them to Gaveston, or the idea that Edward removed, Isabella's children from her care. But anyway, there really is no evidence that Isabella had any problem with Gaveston. And in fact, if you think about how she joined his household, she married to him when she was 11. Piers and Edward's relationship had been going on for much longer than that. I'm sure, she came in as a child. She was probably charmed by Gaveston, who even according to his enemies was, handsome and very sort of attractive. And she probably just took him as, a fixture of the court and of her husband's life. It's very different for Hugh, who supervened on the marriage several years later, and he was also ruthless in a way in which Piers Gaveston was not. It would have been, natural for Isabella to feel that, Hugh Despenser was sort of alienating her husband's affections from her. in terms of Isabella's shrewdness and her capacity as a ruler, there isn't much evidence of it either way in terms of historical evidence. She did mess up after taking over with Mortimer. So as I said, she wasn't a particularly better example of statesmanship than Edward himself was. But we don't know what happened there. It might be that Mortimer was primarily responsible for what happened after they took over. And I decided to make, the moment I decided that Isabella didn't have any reason to object to Piers and Edward's relationship, I liked Isabella, so I was going to make her a sympathetic character. And I was going to be sympathetic to her if she was going to be sympathetic to Piers. And that meant in the book crediting to her advice some of the half-decent decisions that Edward made. And there is really no historical evidence that she was responsible for those. That's entirely my fabrication. But, there is no evidence against it either. So I just assumed that she was a shrewd person and that Edward was perhaps even more useless than he actually was. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, everybody who reads the novel seems to like Isabella.
Now, but what I do find baffling, and you're going to have to explain this because I must say I don't quite get it, is I just from the afterword of the book, you seem quite sympathetic to Hugh Despenser the Younger. And I don't think many of your readers probably share that assessment. And I confess I didn't particularly. So why do you like Hugh Despenser the Younger, who seems really quite a horrible to me?
Yeah, I mean, I think readers have different response. Okay, so I have a number of people who said to me he was horrible, and even so, though he didn't deserve that death. But I have also other friends. Like I had a straight friend saying he was hateful, but in a kind of seductive sort of way. I had a gay reader who said he was devious, but delightfully so. So yeah, I guess people have different opinions. For me, I think I was sympathetic to Hugh because I'm attracted to him, which clearly suggests I would be a sorry excuse for a ruler, for a king. I don't know why I like Hugh so much. I guess maybe I see him, I sort of connect with Edward and probably see Hugh through Edward's eyes. But also, although this is a sort of chicken and egg scenario, but I also modeled Hugh on his looks, on somebody I happen to have a very slight crush for at the time. So it might be that kind of sort of crush spilled over Hugh, but it might be that I actually chose to model Hugh's looks on this person because I fancied Hugh to begin with. I don't know. The thing is, I guess I don't see Hugh as truly evil. And by truly evil, I mean, psychopathic or sociopathic people who I find boring because, there's no inner conflict there. They don't feel guilt. They don't feel regret. I mean, there's nothing to explain and no kind of tension to unravel in that kind of people who are what I see as quintessentially evil. The way I see Hugh is somebody who, yes, was misguided, had a very strong will to power. He was ruthless, but he was also capable of feeling, despite what he himself said and what some of the people around him said. And also, and again, this was a conversation I had with Catherine Warner, the historian whose work I relied on so heavily. She kind of at one point told me that there was a certain method, as in some kind of almost code of honor to his villainy, and in the sense that he went after certain people who probably you can sort of infer that he might have had some good reasons, at least in some cases, to go after them. Some of the things that are said about Hugh, such as the fact that he tortured a widow and so on, again, Catherine Warner proved quite convincingly that that's likely to be a fabrication. So, yeah, I mean, I was conscious that a writer is not supposed to become too emotionally invested with his characters because then you become kind of sentimentally attracted to them. I don't know if I managed to do that, but I was conscious that I shouldn't make Hugh come across better than he was, because the weight of the evidence is that he was pretty bad and pretty appalling. But at the same time, I couldn't help becoming really fascinated by him as I wrote him, and being really sort of attracted to him. I mean, I think that's the thing, I'm very discriminating when it comes to men in real life, but not when it comes to fiction. Some of the best of the most compelling fictional characters are bad men, and he was one of them, and I fancied him.
Yeah, well, I mean, I shouldn't talk, I suppose, because I'd be off chasing Damery, and to no avail, and it all leading to being completely miserable. So, yeah, so it's all a matter of personal taste, I suppose.
Yes.
What the novel does very successfully, going back to Isabella, I think, is to show Isabella's limited range of options as a woman, even as a queen. So even as a woman who, relatively speaking, has power in the midst of all of these events. And at least my reading of the novel is that that limited range of options is what results in her getting entangled with Mortimer. And as you said, that proves not to be the best idea. How difficult was it for you to draw the complexity of her character convincingly, and indeed to write female characters?
Yeah, this is interesting because, as you say, or as I said before, people. That is perhaps the point of agreement that readers have, is that everybody seems to like Isabella. I wonder what that is. It's interesting that some of the books that have to do with same-sex desire that I enjoy the most are written by women. I'm thinking about Mary Renault's work. I'm thinking about The Persian Boy. And people say, her books about gay male relationships are more successful than her books about, lesbians. And perhaps because it gives, the different gender gave them a kind of critical distance. And maybe that's what's happening in the ways in which I seem to have been quite successful in rendering Isabella. I completed the draft of the first draft of this book in 10 weeks, during an autumn term. I would just, come back home, finish my work, and then start writing at night, into the night, and during term time. And it was like being on, it was like being actually in love, right? When you actually literally fall in love, which is not something I'm prone to. It happens very rarely to me to have, to properly fall in love, not just have a slight crush. And it was like that. It was a kind of high, that feeling of obsession. But in that first draft, Isabella actually had a more minor role. She was there in the first part of the book, but she kind of tended to disappear a little bit later. And then I gave the book to read, the first draft to read to actually a common friend, amongst others, Martha Marie Kleinhans, and to other friends of mine, and everybody came back saying, you need to write more of Isabella into the book because she's a good character and there's not enough of her. And so then I did it again, and at that point I don't think it was particularly difficult. She spoke to me quite easily. I mean, her situation is it's easy to sympathize with her, right? I mean, there's a husband that you kind of fancy, and then here comes a villain and snatches him from you. I mean, it's so I suppose it was, and I've always liked strong female characters, as every good gay man. So I suppose it was not difficult to paint her. I didn't think explicitly in terms of what are the constraints on her choices. I think that things were in the background of my mind, but when you're writing fiction, often it's kind of a more instinctive, I suppose, process. You don't necessarily stop to you don't necessarily have those things right at the forefront of your mind. They just happen. Yeah, so the writing Isabella was fairly easily. I think, I had more troubles writing like the characters I didn't like Lancaster. And in fact, Lancaster doesn't take much space in the book because he was one of the people who bored me. And, I couldn't quite sort of switch into his frame of mind. I could only dislike him intensely. And so, yeah, those are the more difficult characters, are the ones that I really can't find a reason to like.
Okay. I'm going to turn to a question from our audience, from Alexander Main, who asks, Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles is a very famous example of a queer historical fiction text, which focuses on Achilles and Patroclus and the siege of Troy. Do you think there are any other notable characters in history who could also feature in a similar text? So, any other ideas as to who could feature?
Well, yeah, plenty of them. And I think, as I said, I'm particularly fond of Mary Renault's books, the ones set in ancient Greece. And her cycle on Alexander is absolutely fantastic. The Persian Boy, particularly, which is the second volume, is a masterpiece, I think. And I think, the only reason why I don't say that it's one of the influences on my work is that I don't want to sound, arrogant, by comparing myself to her. But that's a fantastic book. And generally, I find Alexander the Great such a fascinating character. And to me, the best, several novels have been written about him, but by far the best rendition is Mary Renault's Alexander cycle. And I discuss Alexander the Great also in my academic book in the first chapter.
Turning back to sexual constitution of political authority, you also discuss the tropes around homosexuality as a polluting force and its historical use in Irish nationalist rhetoric that presents it as the quintessentially English vice. And in that regard, what I've always found fascinating is how same-sex desire can be rhetorically deployed in a multiplicity of competing and conflicting ways in political struggle. So it was deployed by the English and other Europeans throughout the period of exploration and colonization to construct the colonized as immature and lacking the ability to self-rule. We know it continues to get deployed in anti-colonial struggles, problematically. And it also sometimes gets used in this imagining of some kind of pre-colonial, mythical, utopian sexual political space of a more pluralist time before the arrival of the colonizers, which is often deployed by lesbians and gays in anti-colonial, post-colonial settings. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this quite remarkable malleability or plasticity of sexuality in the way it can get used in whatever way you discursively seem to need it by different forces in politics.
Yeah, I think probably I'd keep the kind of two issues separate. So on the one hand, there is the question of how same-sex desire has been ideologically deployed in the British context through the centuries in order to construct legitimate political authority as incompatible with same-sex desire. And that's, what my 2015 academic book centers. On the other hand, there is the question of how same-sex desire and today homosexuality has been used in the sort of international arena during colonial and post-colonial times to legitimize and delegitimize the pre-colonial past, the colonial empire, and decolonization and recolonization. So in respect of this question, I think you're absolutely right that these political deployments of homosexuality are sort of mind-bogglingly contradictory. So much that one wonders if there is a degree of historical amnesia going on there, right? But that is, to the extent, for example, that homosexuality is now represented in kind of post-colonial struggles as a vice of the West, right? And if you then sort of look at the historical record, you might see that actually the problem of homosexuality seems to have been introduced by Western powers in these colonized territories. But that kind of amnesia is not always there. So I thought, one really interesting example is Singapore, when when it was decided to abolish, the crime of buggery, but retaining the crime of gross indecency between males, some of what was said by politicians was very candid. They basically said, yes, we recognize that actually there was no crime of gross indecency until it was colonially imposed on us. But that has now become part of our culture. That's what they're saying, and it's therefore something that has been weaved into our fabric, into the ways in which we stress family values and so on. And so this is now part of Singaporean culture, and that's why we're not going to get rid of it. I think your question was about how is it that homosexuality lends itself to all these almost contradictory deployments? I wonder if it has something to do with the ways in which homosexuality, and not just same-sex desire, but homosexuality kind of causes this kind of discursive closure. So when you invoke it, it's almost like you end up in this polarized space, because if you think about the kind of time when it was, the kind of heyday of colonialism, it was also the time when the rhetoric about homosexuality was really, really heightened in Britain. It's the time when homosexuality is represented as a crime worse than murder. And I'm not sort of being hyperbolic here. This is what they actually said, in newspapers, in the courts. They were saying that homosexuality was a crime worse than murder. So basically the worst you could possibly do. And so I think that idea, on the one hand, became, really, really sort of congealed, and we kind of live with the legacy of that. And on the other hand, at around the same time, I suppose, it was also liberalism heyday, and the what must remain one of the, if not the definitive statement of liberalism, John Stuart Mill's Hammer Principle. I've always thought that he must have had homosexuality in mind, when he claimed that societies do not have a right to interfere with the private conduct of individuals when they are engaging in activities that only affect themselves or consenting others. I always thought surely he had in mind, same-sex sexual activity when he was writing that. And so you kind of have this situation where, on the one hand, homosexuality becomes representative of everything, of the worst that you could possibly imagine, a crime worse than murder. And on the other hand, it becomes a paradigmatic case of a kind of activity that it is illegitimate for states to prescribe, to prohibit. And that kind of causes also, that kind of polarization, this double structure of homosexuality almost causes some kind of discursive closure, I think, so that, in the kind of post-colonial context, I think we are still in that kind of situation whereby now we have become attached to the idea that homosexuality is that kind of activity par excellence that a liberal state and a state that is respectful of human freedom and human rights cannot possibly prescribe, because it does not harm anyone. And on the other hand, you still have this attachment to that idea of homosexuality as something absolutely abominable. I mean, in the 19th century, when you read the word abominable, that typically refers to homosexuality. Homosexuality is often not mentioned specifically, because it was the crime that you're not supposed to mention, because from medieval times, the idea was that if you mentioned it directly, then you would get ideas into people's minds, and that's why it becomes the unmentionable crime, right? Something that you shouldn't actually directly refer to, lest people should become attracted to it. But I think that's part of the reason why homosexuality lends itself to this sort of contradictory deployments, and also the ways in which it seems really difficult to move past this impasse, if you like.
Now, I won't give the ending of the Spellbinders away, except to say that it doesn't end in the way in which, for example, Marlowe finishes with Edward II. And I want to tie this into a question we've received from Daniel Monk. Daniel asks, was your choice of Edward II rather than James I influenced by the absence of a happy ending? How much is tragedy a part of the appeal of others to Edward? I mean, I must say that I've always and I don't know what this says about me, but I've always quite loved the dramatic and I think very sort of sexualized climax of Marlowe's play. Were you not tempted to give him a big send-off? And are you attracted to happy endings or tragedy?
Yeah, I like tragedies in plays. I don't probably particularly enjoy unhappy endings in fiction, but I don't mind them if they're intelligent. I guess probably, open-ended endings are good. Tragic endings are not, I guess, my sensibility does not make me prefer them. I have to say, I mean, to address Daniel's question, no, I think the reason why I focused on Edward rather than James is just that, Edward's life was just so, it just is so dramatic and so adventurous. There are all these chases and he's dethroned. It just seemed more interesting to me. Also, I can be incredibly trivial for some of the reasons I do stuff. I just fancied, I pictured Edward in a way that made me fancy him and his lovers. And I didn't picture James as somebody I would necessarily be attracted to. And so that for me was enough of a reason to decide to write about Edward. In terms of the ending, initially I thought, yes, this has to end badly. And I thought, there was even some kind of final sentence I had in my mind, which was something like, and then darkness, literally to just make him die, to make him, the flame is extinguished. But then I started reading about, what might have happened to Edward. And I came across this Fineschi letter hypothesis, according to which, he goes, Edward manages to escape from captivity and manages to make his way, of all places, to Italy. And then even went on a kind of pilgrimage, drawing my mother, sort of obliging my mother to follow me in this very remote place in Lombardy, where this abbey is in a completely kind of backwaterish part of Lombardy in the hills, and where this abbey is, where Edward is supposed to have retired and then eventually died, and there's supposed to be his tomb there as well. And I don't know if it's because I'm Italian that I became really fascinated by this hypothesis, but again, Catherine Warner wrote a book about the possible different outcomes of Edward's story. And, she provides enough, I think her analysis suggests that it's entirely possible that the Fineschi hypothesis is the correct one. And I became intrigued by it and just sort of ran with it. And so that explains my choice of ending.
Okay. Finally, I want to try to connect this discussion to the theme of this year's Being Human Festival, New Worlds. We've been discussing a lot of history. You've also made the claim that same-sex desire continues to impact upon the way in which suitability for public office is understood. How do you see this as continuing to resonate?
Yeah, so about a decade, a bit less, maybe 8 years ago, Smith published, I can't remember her first name, but she published a book about the treatment of gay politicians in the tabloid press. So it's a much more recent, it's focused on a much more recent time than the book. My analysis ends with the mid-20th century in my academic book. And Smith found that gay politicians are still not treated the same as heterosexual ones because their sexuality still remains to some extent newsworthy. But also, unless they are out and preferably partnered, that they can be treated quite unsympathetically. So same-sex desire still seems to matter to political power in Britain. I am personally intrigued by the ways, the relative paucity of parliamentarians who are gay or who at any rate do not have a gender presentation which is not a masculine one. And I think that is because, that's where the book becomes more theoretical rather than focusing on what actually, what the historical record is. And I kind of connect that idea to the ways in which political power is heterosexualized, and having a non-masculine gender presentation makes you socially readable as a bottom. And being socially readable as a bottom means not being somebody who can be credited with reliable leadership, because you need a top, so you need a phallic sort of figure in order for you to have that credibility as a leader. I even connect this to the idea of the service conception of authority, right? So the idea that authorities are there to provide us with services, and I kind of draw an analogy between this and S&M encounters, and where the bottom ultimately remains or should remain in charge, like the electorate, right? They have the power to decide that the top is not a good top enough, and to choose a different one next time. And the politicians will need to respond to that. But at the same time, the top needs to be a credible top. And I think, that in kind of broader sort of social discourses, people who don't have that kind of masculine appeal are not seen as reliable tops. And I think that also explains why women are not, female politicians still have hurdles in their political life to pass that, male politicians who are gender normative in their gender presentation don't have. And it's the fact that they are seen as automatically as sort of penetrable, and therefore as lacking in that kind of phallic authority.
Well, I think we see this illustrated in interesting ways in recent political campaigns. It's been argued that Boris Johnson frequently draws upon heterosexual imagery in the context of Brexit and COVID. I think we even saw that today, where he's like, like firing antibodies in a very kind of phallic sort of description of it, self-description. Trump and Bolsonaro see themselves as almost literally wrestling with COVID. On the other hand, I can't even begin to unravel the Trump campaign's use of the Village People's macho man. And when we see a candidate for president, such as Pete Buttigieg, it strikes me that, deliberately or not, there is something extremely desexualized about his self-presentation. Or maybe that's just me, but in which everything about him seems to scream public virtue, and that he could rule, not be governed by private passions. Does your work suggest, I would suggest it does, that none of this is a coincidence?
Well, I suppose so. It's funny you said, you have that reaction because to Buttigieg, because you like Damory, but we leave that inconsistency aside, I suppose.
Well, I should say I like Buttigieg during the campaign when he was going on Fox, the Fox network a lot, and really his put downs were fantastic. So maybe I've started to come around to him.
Yeah, so I think there's a great deal of irony going on there. I mean, Trump seems oblivious to the irony of his use of the Village People's anthems, or perhaps not. Actually, I read an article in The Atlantic that suggested that actually camp, that Trump is a master of campiness because, the jokes and doublespeak really suit, the ways in which he needs to prevaricate and distract during his political speeches. But there's irony in Buttigieg as well, because he seems perhaps he's oblivious to the irony that kind of ostensibly desexualized, virtuous boy look is actually the stuff of fantasy, not just for many gay men, but I suspect also a lot of heterosexual women. So it is interesting that Trump wears his heterosexuality on his sleeve. I mean, to the point that he gets away with behavior that is now generally considered as monstrous in terms of how he talks about women and how he sexualizes women. And yet, Buttigieg, on the other hand, hides his sexuality under white shirt, tails, and ties. I mean, it is. I suppose it is, indicative of some of what my 2015 book tries to argue.
In terms of gender, you've mentioned women as rulers. Perhaps one interesting comparison is to the childless woman as political leader, where they can either be mother to the nation, or their failure to reproduce leaves them somehow lacking in the experience necessary for public office. But even those analogies seem a little bit tenuous. So how does gender figure here?
Yeah, I think, there is still, gender is really interesting now, I think, in the 21st century, in the second decade of the 21st century, because it's undeniable that there is a momentum that seems to be really making a difference in the general sensibility to gender issues. So on the one hand, it's much easier to teach feminist legal theory these days than it was, a decade ago or 2 decades ago, when students were much more resistant to it. So I think on the one hand, and there are academics' analysis which suggests that, in our field, the law, that feminists have made incredible strides in shaping, the political agenda at the international and national levels, and in having, their own understandings of legal regulation actually implemented into actual policy. Yet, on the other hand, you still see all of this other data, right, about the ways in which women still disproportionately bear the burden of child rearing, even when they're fully employed. They still do most of the domestic housework, even when they are fully employed as their heterosexual partners. So there is still obviously a long way to go. And I think that in terms of ideological representations, women just start off in political life and they have to overcome this presumption, I think. It's a rebuttable presumption, but it is a presumption that works against them, that they are not natural leaders. I think, there is still that, that set of associations with the femaleness and nurturance and so on, which is still, constrains the ways in which, as you were putting it, a public persona for a female politician can be successfully constructed and deployed. So I think, there is a presumption that somehow they are lacking in leadership, which they have to work against in a way in which, heterosexual males don't have to, or even gay men, so long as they are projecting the correct gender presentation. Correct.
Well, finally, what are you working on now, Aleardo, and how are fiction and scholarship aligning in the future for you?
Yeah. In terms of my academic work, I have been working on a draft of a book which is a law and literature project with possibly more literature than law, and it's about we're talking about happy endings or tragic endings, and it's actually just about that. It's about mid-century queer fiction, which is notable or infamous for its tragic endings. And it's an analysis of what were the constraints at work on authors of mid-century queer fiction that made these unhappy endings almost inevitable. And then I kind of draw an analogy between authors of fiction and same-sex attracted people, so authors of queer fiction and same-sex attracted people as authors of their own lives. And I try to show that these kind of heteronormative constraints also affect the ways in which we can be successful authors of our own lives, and draw some sort of policy implications from that. So that's my law and literature project. It was very interesting because I did some archival work, which was fascinating. And in terms of fiction, I have started writing, I have probably about 50,000 words of a novel, which is a kind of contemporary rendition of the myth of Gilgamesh. But, I'm kind of coming close to the end, but I don't know what to think about it. It's just been a completely different experience from writing the story of Edward, where I felt this compulsion, literally, as I said, that took me, like, the first draft was completed in 10 weeks. And certainly this has been going on, for much, much longer than that, this second attempt at writing fiction. So I don't know what will happen to it, but, I still plan to keep a foot in both camps.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That brings us to the end of tonight's event. I want to thank Professor Aleardo Zanghellini for his insights around both theory and fiction. The Spellbinders is published by Left Press, and The Sexual Constitution of Political Authority is published by Routledge. I want to also thank our audience for joining us and participating. And finally, I want to thank the Being Human Festival for including this event on this year's program. The Being Human Festival is online this year. You can see the full program at beinghumanfestival.org. The festival can be found at Being Human Fest on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and the hashtag is BeingHuman2020. To improve the festival in years to come, take a moment to fill in our feedback survey. Your feedback is incredibly valuable, and a feedback survey is being emailed to all members of the audience tonight. Please help us to keep as many festival events as possible free. If you would like to support the festival by making a donation, please go to www.beinghumanfestival.org/support-us. Thank you, and good evening from the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies in London. Thank you very much, Ali.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much.